Hello and welcome to this interview with author Professor Abigail Favale, who has written this fantastic book called The Genesis of Gender. Thank you very much for being with me this afternoon.
I'm happy to be here.
So for our audience who really should go out and buy the book, they will find out in chapter 1 your personal story. But for those who don't know, do you mind giving a quick summary of your road to Damascus?
Sure. Yeah, it's a very weird story. So if you want a longer version, I actually wrote a book about that called Into the Deep, an Unlikely Catholic Conversion. So I grew up as a conservative evangelical in the Western United States. And when I went to college, I did a deep dive into feminist theology and feminist biblical criticism. I guess one way to put it is that I had a desire to better understand my dignity as a woman. And at the time, I thought that feminist thought would be the best way to find that. Spoiler alert, ironically, I found it in the Catholic Church, which I never would have predicted. So then in my 20s, I went into graduate school, actually in the UK, in Scotland, and studying feminist literary criticism and gender theory. And really in that time, feminism became my religion. I usually describe it as kind of a postmodern feminist perspective. And then things really rapidly changed when I became a mother at the age of 29 for the first time. And that experience, for a variety of reasons, began to disrupt some of the very settled opinions that I had absorbed from my feminist beliefs, such as the idea that men and women are basically interchangeable, that gender is mostly a social construct, that an unborn child isn't really a human being. And as those settled beliefs began to become unsettled, then I had this newfound desire to begin to really, what is the truth, right? So I began to ask questions that I hadn't asked in years or maybe ever. And those questions eventually landed me in the Catholic Church. So now I still continue to write about gender and feminism, but from a Catholic perspective.
Yeah, not to ambush you beyond some of the things that I said we were going to talk about with the previews here, but something that came to mind there from what you said. I've spoken to both Louise Perry and Mary Harrington before this, and all of your books are fantastic, create a little trinity there that I recommend everyone go and check out. But from all of your accounts of what has changed your mind on the second to fourth wave feminist paradigm is motherhood. And I wanted to ask your perspective on sort of where we're headed culturally when in the UK at the moment, 52% of women have reached 30 and don't have any children. And there are quite a few women who are deferring having a family to either pursue education as you have or their careers. And it's gotten to the point now where Cambridge University is giving fertility classes to young women to say, you might want to consider family planning in your career ambitions. Without lots of women taking on motherhood and realizing the importance of the infant mother dyad, how do we shake women culturally out of some of the more harmful beliefs that they've taken on?
You know, that's a really good question, because sometimes I wonder if some of the confusion we have about gender or that sex is a spectrum, right? These ideas that seem so detached from reality, is that for the laptop class, especially for women in the laptop class, I think it's very easy to believe that, yeah, there's basically no difference between me and a man, right? So we put young girls on the pill at a very young age. So there's this assumed sterility, right? So there's kind of this default mode of women operating in the world with artificially created male physiology, basically. And that's just becoming this more exaggerated form now with the transgender phenomenon. But that's a really good question. I don't know that there's this way to kind of socially engineer it. And I also know that it's not as if like, oh, if you have a child, you will have these beliefs, right? I know that my story isn't a formula, but nonetheless, I have seen the same pattern in Louise's story and Mary's story and my own. And that there is, like, motherhood can open you up in a way, and that is unprecedented, right? And so I think there is something that's lost because we've really minimized and pathologized that for women. And we've told them that actually happiness and freedom can be found from suppressing that part of themselves, rather than actually that can be found through actualizing that part of your nature. So, I mean, I guess we're doing our part to tell our side of the story. Yeah,
you're right in that there's something that stuck out in my mind when I read the book, was that you made the point that for the first time in human history, with the invention of the birth control pill, there is a biological process that has had its default setting to be turned to off when it is usually on. It's the first intervention of its kind, and so you're eradicating sex differences and putting women's physiology on par with men's physiology for the sake of total workplace enrollment at the expense of the family and being embodied. And of course, there's going to be consequences that come from that. Speaking of chapter 1 as well, you elucidated something interesting about postmodernism, and this is why. So not all of our audience is Catholic. I'm practicing, but some are still secular, and my colleagues. And so even if you aren't believing, I'll say this to the audience, Abigail's heuristic of analysis by comparing things to our civilizational founding myth is very interesting in the way that it frames how the postmodern feminist and gender paradigm fits into our own. And here you hit upon something very interesting about postmodernism and logocentrism. So if you don't mind, according to the gender paradigm, there is no creator, and so we are free to create ourselves. The body is an object with no intrinsic meaning. We give it whatever meaning we want, using technology to undo what is perceived to be natural. We do not receive meaning from God or our bodies or the world. We impose it. What we take to be real is merely a linguistic construct, ergo we should consciously wield language to conjure the reality we want. To be free is to transgress limits continually, to unfetter the will. Woman and man are language-based identities that can be inhabited by anyone, because truth is just a story we tell ourselves. All self-told stories are true. So, with this conception, is woke social constructivism just a malevolent form of logocentrism?
I mean, I think it's an attempt to replicate what logocentrism used to be the guardian of, but it's not logocentrism because there's no logos and there's no center, right? So there's only every single individual self that is now its own logos, and that is the center, right? So there's no kind of cohesive ground of meaning that we receive, right? Rather, it's this projection of meaning, this creation of meaning that I, as an individual, self-determining creature, kind of project and enact in the world. So I would say it's kind of the inverse, rather than it's an attempt to replace logocentrism, right? But it diffuses the logos. It scatters, right, rather than gathering.
Yeah, well, you specifically wrote about the ability for them to sort of speak themselves into being, kind of evoking the opening chapter of the Gospel of John. For now, I merely want to point out that the constructivist view of language is a complete inversion of the correspondence view depicted in Genesis. In this divinely revealed origin story, our language does not project meaning onto things, rather, meaning intrinsically exists in what God creates. Do you mind explaining one of the things you identified in the chapter about the name recognition of Adam and the animals? Because that was a really interesting part.
Right. So there's this fun passage in Genesis 2 where, so in this particular creation account, a human being has been created, right? And the Hebrew is the Adam. So it's this kind of generic human being, like earthling, you might think. So this earthling has been created. And in my reading and John Paul II's reading, that earthling is at this point not sexually differentiated, right? And this is the first time in the text that there's something that's not good or not complete. And it's the fact that this earthling's alone. So God responds to this by creating all these other animals and creatures out of the clay and bringing them to the earthling so that the earthling can name it, right? So there's this movement of like God creating. So he creates something with its own nature. Like, let's just say a gopher, right? So he creates this gopher and he brings it to the earthling, and then the earthling looks at it, recognizes its nature, and then provides a name that that expresses that nature, right? So that's the relationship between creation and naming, or divine language names what God creates, or it names what exists and what is real, right? It tries to express that reality. Whereas in the first account of Genesis, what you were talking about just a minute ago, divine speech creates, right? So it creates what is real, whereas human speech names what is real, tries to recognize what is real. And we see this really profoundly when, after the sexual differentiation of the human being into male and female, the male human being sees the woman, recognizes that she is both like and unlike him, and then he names her Isha, or woman, a word that expresses her likeness and her dissimilarity from him, right? So we get that sense that her name is not arbitrary, but actually is an expression of her nature, which has been created by God. So I think in the gender paradigm, and be a simple way of putting it, is that in the gender paradigm, human speech takes on the power of divine speech, or tries to, right? So human speech tries to usurp divine speech. So the idea is that it is human speech that creates what is real, rather than trying to name and express and recognize what is real. A really simple example of how this is being used actually is the kind of new phrase of sex being assigned at birth, right? Assigned, that's a very philosophically loaded term. So that's expressing the idea that sex is this kind of arbitrary human created category that we then kind of speak into being by assigning it, right? As opposed to, say, sex being recognized or recorded at birth. So sex being actually a recognition of something that exists prior to it being named, right?
Yeah, we had this conversation in the office when we were discussing C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And again, to build the bridge to the secular members of our audience, what you can construe it as in your mind as there is an objective undercurrent to reality. Things are made with a certain telos, with a certain purpose. They have inherent properties. And so we as human beings use language as an apparatus to detect the meaning in it. We observe and we describe. We don't arbitrarily ascribe meaning to something. And so we have to operate within the parameters of reality rather than trying to remake it through our own speech as if we're somehow moral legislators or able to displace God as creator. And if we try to do that can lead to lots of unhappiness, of course. That was also quite in contravention with some of the founding doctrines that postmodernism based itself on, and I found something very interesting that Marx wrote in German ideology. In direct contrast to German philosophy, which descends from heaven to earth, here we ascend from earth to heaven. I've been working on, in the background, and I think it will be out by the time this interview goes live on our website, a video which talks about how Marxism is a praxeological tool for attaining power for the person who is signing up to it. And Marx's obsession with particularly Mephistopheles in Faust puts him on the side of the devil. And so there is an interesting thing there of it's fulfilling the Genesis 3 promise of if you have this amount of knowledge, ye shall attempt to be as God. So it's just interesting how that corresponds in today with the use of language to create reality, trans women or women. Speaking of women and the creation myths, so chapter 2, you contrasted the Mesopotamian creation myth, the opening chapters of Genesis. And this is one of the reasons I really wanted to speak to you, because my boss, Carl, we sat down and went through Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex. I tortured him for 2 hours. If I might say, it's 900 pages, the worst things I've ever read, right? It's awful. And the amazing thing that you came to in this book, well before I did this video, so obviously I've got to credit you with the idea, completely disparately, is that Simone de Beauvoir has the spirit of Tiamat in the Enumalis, and she's sort of generating waves of feminism sent forth to drown culture. And we had the same thing there, which I just thought was brilliant. Tiamat, the woman mother, led the struggle against the strongest and most nay-looking of her descendants, Bel Marduk. He, having challenged her in combat, killed her and slashed her body in two after a frightful battle, omitting the fact that she was a dragon. With one half he made the vault of heaven, and with the other the foundation for the terrestrial world. He gave order to the universe and created humanity. In the Eumenides drama, which illustrated the triumph of patriarchy over maternal right. Orestes also assassinates Clytemnestra. Through these bloody victories, the virile force of the solar forces of order and light win over feminine chaos. These legends have a profound meaning. At the moment when man asserts himself as subject and freedom, the idea of the other becomes mediatory. From this day on, the relationship with the other is a drama. The existence of the other is a threat and a danger. You analyze the Mesopotamian creation myth by saying the Genesis cosmology bestows upon human beings an exclusive kind of dignity, a dignity rooted in their roles as image bearers. Genesis recognizes the duality of humankind, male and female. This difference is part of the goodness of creation, and both sexes share fully in the divine image and the commission to tend the earth. There is no sense of hierarchy here between male and female, but rather a shared, benevolent governance over the rest of the creation. Would you mind just explaining the dichotomy between the Enumalis and Genesis, and why Genesis comes out on top?
Sure. So the Enuma Elish, I didn't just kind of pick an arbitrary myth to compare it to, but the Enuma Elish is the Babylonian creation myth, Mesopotamian creation myth. And so particularly in Genesis 1, when it was likely written, would have been in the context of the Babylonian exile. So essentially it's an attempt to demythologize the Babylonian creation myth, right? So it's almost this direct counter to the Enuma Elish. And you can see it when you compare, especially Genesis 1, when God begins to create the heavens and the earth, right? So you really, I think, begin to see the particular emphases of Genesis 1 only when you kind of put it against the backdrop of the Enuma Elish, right? So when we compare these things, we see a lot of differences, but in the Enuma Elish, there's this whole long prelude about the creation of the gods, and almost all creation narratives are like this too, which highlights the uniqueness of Genesis 1 because God's already there. God exists. There is no progenitor to God, whereas in the Enuma Elish, it's Marduk who's the creator God. So Marduk is kind of the Yahweh counterpart, but we have to have this whole long story about how even Marduk came to be, right? And so there's these like primordial beings, I guess. Tiamat is this sort of feminine divine principle. And basically she and Marduk have this cosmic battle where he kills her. And then as this afterthought, like he's kind of, just purged his like battle rage, and he's looking at her corpse and he's like, wow, what can I do with this? And he creates the universe out of her corpse. So he creates the heavens and the earth out of her corpse. And he kills her consort, and out of that slain God's blood, he creates human beings to be slaves, right? So all of these things contrast so much with the creation stories in Genesis. So human beings are an afterthought. The creation of the world is an afterthought. And our purpose as human beings is to be slaves and serve the gods. So the Genesis elevation of human beings as the culmination of God's creative work, and the fact that they bear God's image, expresses, again, this idea of human dignity. And one thing that I think is really important is that the Genesis creation accounts are very interested in sexual difference, right? In both the first creation account in Genesis 1 and the second creation account in Genesis 2, the climax of the creation story is not just the creation of human beings, but the sexual differentiation of human beings in both creation accounts. And we get that really emphasized in the second one, as I've described before, because we have this whole climactic telling of how human beings became sexually differentiated. And that sexual differentiation creates this capacity for communion, for relationship, without which, we're not right, like this original solitude of the earthling. We're made for love. We're made to give and receive love, and sexual difference is a sign of that. And if you compare Genesis to other creation accounts, you really can't find any other creation myth that, one, cares so much about sexual difference, and two, presents it as something positive rather than something gone wrong, right? So a lot of creation myths posit woman as almost like this kind of deformed afterthought, or that the natural state of men and women is conflict and division, or subservience and domination. But in the Genesis account, that dynamic is a corruption of the original dynamic between men and women. So there's this unique dignity that's given to sexual differentiation in Genesis.
Yeah, and downstream of that founding mythology, the cultural practices which grow out of that, they're uniquely respectful of the complementarianism naturally arising between men and women, and that creates for a much more healthy society. However, if you then decide to culturally regress, we've killed God in the Nietzschean sense, we've technologically disembodied ourselves, and then suddenly you introduce Beauvoir's feminist existentialism to this, you get to the place of the chaotic devouring dragon mother being the spirit of current culture. And I said this earlier in a discussion on the concept of love with my colleague Stelios. In her embodiment of the kind of Tiamatian dragon figure, this devouring dragon of female sexuality that spawns forth waves of successive feminism to drown the world, she's regressing us back to that place of chaos. What is chaos? Unmitigated potential. And it's very nihilistic, because if you don't have a schema for ordering that chaos, you just get lost in it. And I think the plethora of options opened up to both sexes, despecified from sex now, the amount of jobs, travel opportunities, fear of missing out, arrested development in education, social opportunities, pathologizing commitment as catching feelings, we're kind of lost in that chaos, that cultural milieu. And so it's very difficult to try and reach out and create something in your own. But you wrote this great little paragraph in isolation, and I think you put it even better than I do. Here we are, bobbing in the wake of the fourth wave, although to be honest, by now the metaphor is broken down. We no longer have a movement that ebbs and recedes with interludes between distinct waves. We are the rolling ocean, fed by numerous streams, like Tiamat, the tumultuous sea goddess from the Enumalis and her many squabbling progeny. So, what are your critiques of Beauvoir's feminism then?
Well, I think Simone de Beauvoir, you can see in The Second Sex this ironic, implicit masculine bias in modern feminism. In other words, this framing that it is better to be as much like a man as possible. And so what really holds women back is their femaleness, right? And this is really pronounced in her existentialist framework, because for her, as an existentialist, the whole purpose of being human, what it means to be human or become human, is to transcend the facticity of our existence. So the way she describes men and women in their natural state, even prior kind of to more complex modern societies, is that women are enslaved to the species. That's how she puts it. So she describes she describes this like kind of fictional or sort of pseudo-historical tribal setting, right, where male activity is described in these very like active, positive ways, whereas female activities of like breastfeeding and childbirth are described in these like limiting and oppressive language, right? So for her, and you can see this especially in the very last word of her book, which I just find so fascinating, that she chooses to end The Second Sex with the word brotherhood, and that's her solution, right? Is this Marxist utopia where men and women can together reclaim their brotherhood, because it's the male model, right? It's the masculine model. So women have to, she describes at pretty much every aspect of female physiology as pathological. It's really wild to read some of her descriptions of, periods and gestation and lactation. And the one chapter, though, that I will say I think is really good and that she's right on about is her chapter on the independent woman, where she writes about how in modern society, a woman basically has to perform as both a perfect man and a perfect woman simultaneously, and that creates this really kind of anxious and distressing state to be in. And I think there's something to that, right, in our contemporary society, because women are supposed to, be in the world. We're supposed to be girl bosses. We're supposed to be like badass cops on TV who are like chasing down criminals in high heels, right? But we're also supposed to be super sexy while we do it. And, so we're supposed to be like this like sex icon, but also this like powerful CEO, right? And like all, so this being able to kind of perform both and both of those things neglect, I think, what is like the kind of natural potentialities of femaleness when it comes to motherhood, right? None of those things, none of those ideals, like all of those ideals basically are an attempt to escape motherhood. And so I really think that is a big part of Simone de Beauvoir's legacy, is is that framing of what oppresses women, and that the solution is a kind of Marxist society in which women have unfettered access to abortion and birth control.
Yeah, in increasing women's grasp on the world, as she would put it, it's become a bit of a chokehold over the culture, and it's siphoning off our differences. When you were talking about the ass-kicking female superhero stereotype, the immediate idea that it brought to me was Charlize Theron in Atomic Blonde, which featured her kicking giant henchmen down the stairs and hitting a man in the stiletto in the back of a cab until he's unconscious. And it immediately makes me contrast to Charlize Theron, who's very successful, very attractive woman in her personal life, saying men need to step up because I'm in my mid-40s and I can't get a date. And it's like saying, well, yes, of course, if you try to displace the role of a man, you're going to limit the amount of men available to you that are excellent enough for you to respect and be attracted to them. So don't deny sex specification and you won't price yourself out of the market, so to speak. And I think that's a very astute point that you've made there, contrasting natural femininity to this pastiche of hypermasculinity that Beauvoir seems to have wanted many women to inhabit. If she did identify that the modern woman is put in an impossible role, I don't see how making every woman the modern woman was a particularly great approach. But maybe I'm just a misogynist.
Well, her approach is the Marxist approach, right? So in her approach, she's kind of critiquing basically the state of the modern woman under capitalism, right? And so there's something to that critique, right? I think there's something about our consumerist culture that has impoverished scripts about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. So I think her critique there is apt, even though I really, reject her, certainly the way she portrays femaleness and also her solution. So the way she frames the problem and her solution, I disagree with. But there's something to her critique about the modern woman.
Well, I think actually going on a detour about commodification then, I think it's correct to identify the fact that contemporary culture is hypersexualized and has a lot of perverse incentives for women to use youth and beauty, not for their intended purpose of being attached to fertility and also cultivating the character to make you a good mother and a lifelong partner to a man who will protect and provide for you, but instead to bait a legion of simps on Twitter and OnlyFans. And so she's correct in her assessment that the commodification, if you want to call it just capitalism, the Marxist conception, is bad for sexual differences and unhealthy for women. But then to abolish the metaphysical constraints that keep activities between human beings virtuous, aka Christianity, that wasn't very sensible, because from my perspective, the most hyper-industrious time of the UK, at least, was Victorian Britain. We had leaps and bounds in productivity and innovation, but we also had plenty of Christian charity and plenty of sensibilities of propriety here. So you need both, and just throwing God out is like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and you wonder why, well, the whole world's drowning. So yeah, not great. Jumping around a bit then, your last chapter, we'll come back to the rest of it later, but this is a really good point. You wrote this: could this be a vision of freedom, perhaps? Man no longer corralled in God's garden and encumbered by God's rules, liberated to find his own meaning and seek his own destiny. That is what freedom has become for us in our historical moment. Stripped from teleology, freedom has been reduced to permissiveness, pushing past limits, transgressing boundaries. But in Genesis, the exile from Eden is not triumphant. It is a funeral weighed down by the pall of death. We're confronted in our time with two divergent understandings of freedom. On the one hand, freedom according to postmodernity, an open-ended process of self-definition whose only limit is death, and on the other, freedom as an ever-deepening sense of belonging and wholeness, not only within oneself, but in relation to all of this. Now, I think with this conception of freedom, you see the sort of anti-natalist death drive of Beauvoir and Firestone start to germinate. You also see it in the kind of parallel Garden of Eden myth that you would see in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, where human beings were born in a state of nature where all property was communal and nature was abundant and we weren't being chased around by bears, I suppose. And then suddenly civilization imposed upon us all these pesky things like relationships, where you don't just sleep with a woman and then you leave and then she raises the kids in some sort of polyamorous polycule. That even Beauvoir fell to the prey of feminist anthropologists, thinking that's how we existed before that. Do you think that the complete eradication of Christianity from public life in lots of the West, America is one of the last vestiges, has led to a devaluation of motherhood? And do you think that it's been subordinated to this new conception of ultimate freedom?
That's a big question.
Sorry.
No. I mean, I'm just chewing on it. So, let me. So on the one hand, I don't know. Have you ever read Charles Taylor, A Secular Age?
No, I haven't.
I mean, it's kind of a beast, but it's really good. And I think in my wrestlings with that, and it's more descriptive than prescriptive, but it is basically this account of how the de-Christianization of society has led to a much different conceptualization of human identity and et cetera. So it's really fascinating. And I think a part of the story that's being told, I guess, is in some ways, like, this is, even by tracing it back to Genesis, this is like the oldest story about human beings that there is, right? It's like a story that keeps playing out over and over and over in different times and historical contexts. And so I guess I don't necessarily have I guess I don't have a ton of nostalgia about, like, oh, it was this era where we really nailed it, or this era, if we could only roll back to this, right? I think that can be a temptation sometimes. Like, I think I have the temptation to romanticize, like, oh, if only I lived in medieval Europe, right? And then I'm like, well, I probably would die when I was like 14 from the plague, right? So there's something, though, about technological progress, I think, that has increased the destructiveness of this story that we're seeing really play out in our time, and especially since really the 20th century. And a big piece of that is, I think, this human desire, which is maybe the oldest human desire, the first bad human desire, which is to reject the goodness of one's nature and want to push past its limits, right? I mean, that's the first sin. Like, that's where things go wrong. And so I think that human tendency has always been there in a certain way. But now in modernity, we no longer have these. I mean, there's really been kind of a breakdown of shared meaning. There's been a breakdown of the family, of the community, right? So this cohesion, this kind of social cohesion, has been eroded and has been lost at the same time as we've had this, like, rise of technological progress, quote unquote, right? That allows us to enact to further extremes our desire to be God. And so that's kind of the narrative that I see playing out. So it's not as if, like, this sense of freedom has never, it's not like this sense of freedom is new. I just think the scale of it and the power of it perhaps is unprecedented because of the loss and the erosion of these structures, these cohesive structures. And then also the increasing power of technology and the use of it, right? Without a context of what is this for, right? Without this teleological sense of which you get from Christianity, but it's also pre-Christian, right? So this is all the ancient wisdom, right? I mean, this is Aristotle, this is Confucius. This is, it's this idea that what happiness, what flourishing is a fulfillment of the kind of creature one is, right? So it is connected to our nature. It's a flourishing of us as human beings, right? So that rejection of teleology, I think, which, yes, was certainly preserved in Christianity in an important way, I think is what we've really lost and what we somehow need to reclaim, whether that's through Christianity, but it also doesn't have to be through Christianity, right? Like, you could go kind of straight to Aristotle or almost any ancient wisdom tradition.
Yeah, from that, I sort of got the idea that freedom is only worth using because you flourish within a set of constraints. And the problem we have with technology at the moment is that it is eradicating those constraints because it's pathologized any constraint, whether adopted or inherited, as some kind of form of oppression, up until the point of if you have a child, it's a limit on your freedom, and so it's something worth either preventing or ending. This is something that you invoked Margaret Sanger on this, from her book Woman and the New Race. And she said, from a chapter called Woman's Error and Her Debt, the error is having too many babies, which has led to all the world's problems. The debt, she must remake the world by freeing herself from the chains of her own reproductivity. Interesting she invokes chains there, because both Marx did at the end of the Communist Manifesto, and Rousseau did at the opening of, oh my God, why am I blanking? The Social Contract, of course. So I'm wondering if the conception of freedom, to combine it with the idea of the sort of dragon of chaos that Simone de Beauvoir is inhabiting, if the conception of freedom is itself at war with the complementarianism of women's role to men. Because as we said before, when we were talking about the man's ability to order things by using language that God has bestowed upon him to correctly identify the nature of God's creation, well, that's the way he emulates God, in proximity to God's example. The way that women seem to emulate God, and this is something you wrote towards the end of the book that I'll quote in a second, because I think this is brilliant genius, right? The way that a woman emulates God is in her capacity from chaotic potential to create life, much like God ordered the chaos that predated him. And so there's a bit that you wrote here is, man has the capacity to transmit life outside himself, while woman has the potential to gestate new life within. If we take these biological realities as a mirror for God and humankind, the male sex is analogous to God because God endows life from himself but stands apart from it. He transcends. The female sex is representative of humankind because its power lies in receptivity. The human being is created to receive the love of God, be inwardly transformed, and let that love bear fruit. Receptivity to God, embodied in the form of woman, is humanity's ultimate purpose. This is the telos of our existence, to say yes to divine grace, be subsumed by divine love, and welcome the inner metamorphosis it brings. Woman, then, is the representative human being before God. She carries the image of this receptivity to which all are beckoned, male and female alike. So is this contention between the conceptions of freedom and responsibility at the heart of why tradition, Christianity, and the exaltation of motherhood seem incompatible with the modern, progressive, feminist deconstruction of all kinds of constraints? Or am I barking up the wrong tree?
No, I don't think you're barking up the wrong tree. Yeah, I think I would like to respond to a lot of what you just raised. So I guess I want to unpack this idea about complementarity a little bit, because I also think that there are bad interpretations of what that looks like, right? So obviously in my work, I critique this idea that sexual difference is a human construct. It isn't real. We should dismantle it, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, I think there's also this very long-standing thread in human thought where the sexes are seen as like polar opposites. So there's almost this polarity. And sometimes I think complementarity, even the word is expressing more of a polarity than a true complementarity. And so, for example, when you just were talking about one way that like man exhibits the image of God is through his use of language, like I would say that applies to both men and women, because that's a human, like that's, so if you're talking about man in the sense of humankind, then yes, I agree. And so when we talk about motherhood and fatherhood and so trying to like bring all this together. So what's the ground of the differentiation between men and women is procreative potential, right? That's what it is. And what it looks like to live that out, that might be biological, right? But I think that every man is called to live out the vocation to fatherhood, and every woman is called to live out the vocation of motherhood, whether or not that happens in the context of biological reproduction. So what does it mean to be a mother in a spiritual sense, right? What does it mean to be a father in a spiritual sense? Like, even if we were to try and list out the traits of a good mother or a good father, we wouldn't have this like list of opposite things. There would be a commonality of many traits, right? Because there's a tenderness, right, in a good father. There's also a strength. There's a sense of protection, right? And those things are also manifested in motherhood, right? But they're embodied differently because the body is different, right? So sometimes what I like to think about what an image I think that can be helpful in thinking about what complementarity looks like is if we think about icons, right? Like an icon of, say, the Virgin Mary holding the child Christ, and an icon of Saint Joseph holding a child Christ. It's not as if like we have tenderness over here and strength over here, right? They're both embodying many of the same kind of human dispositions, but in a masculine mode and in a feminine mode.
Most of the statues of Mary as well see her stepping on a snake to protect Jesus specifically. So she is enacting that kind of protective strength.
Yes, absolutely. Right. So sometimes and so I'm not saying that there aren't more differences than that, but I guess what I'm saying is that even as we talk about sexual difference and sexual asymmetry or complementarity, I think it's also essential to keep in mind that both men and women are fully human, right? So this kind of shared potentiality, especially for things like virtue and holiness and just integrated humanity, are both on the table for men and women, right, to habituate. But again, that will always be embodied differently because of the kinds of bodies that we are. I'm not sure if that makes sense. Anyway, so I just wanted to kind of talk about what complementarity means a little bit, that it's not this like polar opposition. And also when I talk about revaluing motherhood, I'm a Catholic, right? So like most of I have this kind of, you can't see it, but in front of me, I have this like a bunch of pictures of all these like female saints, and almost all of them weren't married. I think I've got St. Margaret of Scotland up there. So she was married. She was a mother in a biological sense, right? But I've got Edith Stein, I've got Joan of Arc, I've got Catherine of Siena, St. Hildegard, right? So there's also this very rich tradition in Catholicism of women becoming mothers while never actually biologically having their own children, right? And so I would love to see our culture rehabilitate the importance and the meaning and the natural vocation we all have to develop our innate potential for motherhood and fatherhood, but not in just this like reductive, necessarily biological way, although I think that's also great, right? So I think that would, like, I just think boys and girls need like a positive calling, maybe men more than anything, because I think our culture no longer has a positive narrative about what it means to be a man. We don't have a coherent rite of becoming a man, right? So all of those things have been kind of stripped away. And so I think increasingly young men are lost and they're kind of looking for what they're supposed to be and who they're supposed to become. And what if we had, from a young age, this positive sense of like, you are a boy, like you are male. And so you are called to be a father in the world. And what that looks like, that might mean having your own family. That might mean, not getting married, but then living out your fatherliness in a different way. But I think that would call us to develop virtue. It would call us to creating, like having a purpose and a sense of meaning, but one that's like created to our nature that we receive, right? That's not this like, oh, what do I want to be in the world? And this kind of ideation fantasy, right? But actually, this is the kind of being I am. And how do I live out that in a way that is fully actualized?
Yeah, to capitalize off that point, I really appreciate how you've said that we have a shared humanity, a shared enterprise, and a shared set of precepts that we operate in the world in. And then the differences in our bodies, which have been slowly erased by technology and culture, if we lean into those, that allows us to have sex selective traits and a sense of purpose and the virtues that we embody. And Jordan Peterson's talked about this plenty before, of where if you look at the average traits of men and women across the Ocean score, the Big Five personality, the average man and the average woman are towards the center of something like agreeableness or neuroticism or conscientiousness. But it's at the endpoints where the differences are most magnified and manifest. And that's why you get it left to their own devices without ESG scores and Californian CEO board requirements, you get lots of men clustering at the top end of business, and you get lots of men occupying the prisons. And so this is something that I was talking to Mary about when she was in the studio. Is it feels like if you lean into that, if you lean into what historically women's social power has been, controlling reputation and keeping the sort of cultural covenant down the great chain of civilizations that they've been entrusted with to transmit values between specifically the infant mother dyad, after quite a lot of the time the men have physically endangered themselves by resettling new territory. I think that that's probably the best way that you can lean into the complementary dynamic, and also make it a more Aristotelian approach of where you voluntarily adopt these virtues via recognition, rather than have it be top down enforced upon you.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And you have to habituate them, right? Like it doesn't just come naturally. I mean, in a Catholic context, you have this language of like masculine genius, feminine genius. And sometimes that's talked about as if it's just like this default mode of being, right? Which there's something to that, but it's actually much more a sense of like, what is the kind of unique genius of my nature that I can, I can habituate and cultivate, right? Like how can I develop that fully? And so I guess I think that there are, on the speaking generally, I think we can talk about innate proclivities or dispositions between the sexes, but also the need to kind of learn from one another to become more fully human. So when I think about like one example of what this could be, I think about unique pathologies, I guess, that are maybe more affiliated with one sex or the other. So, for example, the fact that, as a woman, like for the fact that motherhood involves this kind of whole person gestation, this diffusion of two into one, right? I think there's this danger, this pathology of the kind of smothering mother, right? The mother who wants to possess, right? Who wants to so fully kind of possess her child that it almost becomes this object. And so she inhibits the self-differentiation process of the child. And then the kind of maybe the pathology that the man needs to resist is the fact that he's by nature separate from that which he creates. So there's this default distance. So he has to exercise his will and choose to cross that distance, right? Whereas for a woman, like that, there is no distance, right? So she actually needs to choose to create some distance, right? Whereas a man has to choose to kind of cross that distance. So that's one way I think we can begin to talk about how our sex nature influences us on kind of a whole person level. And that's not strictly biological, but it is linked to biology for sure.
I'm going to have to wrestle with that dichotomy for quite a while, because I've never heard it put like that. And that I definitely think that resonates with my personal experience of where I know plenty of women who have said that when they feel connected to someone, they feel much more embodied than lots of men who feel a bit more emotionally detached, but things are more duty focused. And so one of the enterprises of men that possibly can learn from women is to become more embodied and forthcoming with your emotions, while also having that mind of duty that women are attracted to, and of course is great for being a father. So yeah, I'm gonna have to wrestle with that for a little while. Speaking of biological difference and denialism, then I wanted to move on to the Promethean project that we've already spoken about in the sort of inverse logocentrism that Mary's called Gnostic meat Lego, and that is trans ideology. And you've written here, our bodies are continual reminders to us that we are not autonomous, and that the fantasy of self-creation is no more than a fever dream. The gender paradigm is the Oedipal offspring of feminism, offspring because it is through feminist theory that the concept of gender has taken hold of our cultural imagination, and Oedipal because, like Oedipus's mother of his own father, this concept has eroded the very foundation of feminism, turning woman into an identity that can be freely appropriated by men regardless of material reality. So how, in your conception, has the devouring dragon of feminism been devoured by trans ideology?
Yeah, I think, I'm glad you brought up this part of my argument, because sometimes I get called a TERF, as anyone does who has opinions that are not ideologically compliant.
Yes.
But whenever I get called a TERF, I'm like, you haven't read my work, because a big piece of my argument is that trans ideology or whatever you want to call it is an offspring of feminism, right? That this is kind of like maybe like Frankenstein's monster, right? Like Frankenstein is feminism. And so here, let me unpack that a little bit. Since the second wave, and since basically Simone de Beauvoir, really, feminist thought has been very anti-essentialist, right? So it's really rejected the idea that there is some stable ground to women's nature versus men's nature, right? So, I mean, I remember when I started in college, it was like essentialism and feminist thought is just, it's this taboo, right? You just can't be an essentialist no matter what you do. So then feminism has been very nominalist, right? So there's this irony within feminist thought where it's purportedly supposed to be this movement that is centered upon the well-being of women as a group, while it simultaneously denies that you can really define women as a group, right? So in other words, using that word woman is more for political convenience than it is actually signaling some kind of universal, stable category woman. So already you have this anti-essentialist basis, right? So this weak foundation, I guess, for feminism. And then you also have, as we've already been discussing, this implicit masculine bias, right? So feminism has also been the big force kind of pushing the ideals of contraception and abortion as the solution to women's social problems, right? So when you combine those things, the logical kind of outcome of those ideas, one, that the category woman is basically a construct, right? And that there isn't this essence, this given essence to womanhood. And then also that we should use technology to disrupt our nature in order to be free. Like those are the kind of undergirding ideals that drive kind of transgender movement as well. And so I see a line of continuity there where, basically feminist thought has been sawing off the branch that it's sitting on. As soon as you kind of turn the corner into the 90s, in that time when women's studies becomes gender studies, right? That's when we begin to really see that shift.
It's fascinating that you said soaring off the branch they've been sitting on, because that's exactly what Louise Perry said to me, but for a different angle, in that when she said about the radical abortion movement that's taken it up until birth and how they've pulled apart the logical contradiction of the phrase safe, legal and rare, because if it was safe, why would it need to be rare if there was no moral prohibition? Then they've undermined the main appeal that some of the early feminists lent into with Christianity, and that is the need to care for rather than dominate and exterminate the weak. And if that is the case, then you're going to have no prohibition against men identifying as women, but using their physical prowess to beat up women in the octagon, as Fallon Fox would do, or enter their changing rooms and do unspeakable things to them. And you put this great thing about Beauvoir again. I think your book is like the anti-Beauvoir perfect antidote, because Beauvoir sets I'm going to really struggle to pronounce this word. Faceticity. I hope that's correct. Facticity. There we go. At odds with freedom and immanence in opposition to transcendence, women are oppressed not merely by social forces, but their biology. So it becomes a form of liberation theology to throw off the chains of biology and disembody the will from the body. And of course, it's an outgrowth of feminism, so then it goes straight onto the trans and transhumanist movement. I think you've hit the nail on the head pretty perfectly there. Speaking of the awfulness of the feminist movement way back when, have you ever read Paul Kengor's The Devil and Karl Marx?
No.
Okay, I would recommend it specifically as a Catholic, because he comes at critiquing Marxism, not just looking at Marx's life as a biography, but he also looks at the infiltration of the Catholic Church, the inversion of religious doctrine by the Soviet Union, and he looks at transcripts from the McCarthyist era, where they were interviewing potential communists that had infiltrated various institutions. Later on, he looks at the lives of some of the leftist intellectuals that took Marxism and ran with it. And he looks at Kate Millett, and he interviewed Kate's sister, Mallory. And this is exclusive to the book. And she told Kengor that she thought that Kate manifested the kind of behaviors of demonic possession. So it's a bit kooky, but I'll put it here. Mallory said that Kate lived in darkness for decades following the death of their mother, with her feminist minions surrounding her. Mallory said these minions were all women, acolytes, disciples, all of whom practically worshipped Kate. She was like their guru. Mallory said that these were old, aging lesbian feminists who all slept with each other and all worshipped Kate as their cult leader. Mallory told me poignantly that she could see by looking into Kate's eyes and face that it was highly abnormal. Mallory returned to the demonic point that she said when she would talk to Kate, Kate's face would take on forms. This made Mallory think that Kate had something inside of her. So, as a Catholic feminist, do you think that, having spoken about Marx compared to the quest for knowledge that is promised by the serpent in Genesis 3, do you think there's a kind of demonic undercurrent to lots of these contemporary maladies that pathologize sexual difference?
Yes, I would definitely say so. But again, I think the diabolical current, can manifest in all kinds of different ways, right? So there's always a way that the devil is at work on both, in whatever kind of political camp, right? In a different way. But I would say for sure, okay, so here's maybe a way to get into this question. I've been doing the Ignatian exercises, or kind of beginning to dabble in Ignatian spirituality. And the 14th rule of discernment, Ignatius used this phrase where he calls, he doesn't name Satan, but he just says the enemy of human nature. And he describes him as the enemy of human nature. And that phrase just jumped out to me. And I said, yes, like that. So I think wherever we see some kind of cultural force that is pathologizing human nature, that is showing it as something that is a force or a limit to be overcome, that it is something to be dismantled or erased, then that's the devil at work. Like that is a diabolical work there, because that is exactly his project, right? The enemy of human nature. So we really see this, in any kind of transhumanism. We've talked about abortion. We talked about, I think, the newest version of the pathologization of human nature is the pathologizing of puberty, right? As something that we now need to correct in children who feel distressed in puberty, right? So all of that, I think, I see as a diabolical undercurrent.
It's very interesting, actually, that you brought that up as the enemy of human nature, because immediately what went off in my head to invoke Marx again. He wrote quite a lot of verse when he was studying as a student in Germany, and he wrote a poem called Invocation of One in Despair, which is a declaration of how he will dethrone God and supplant him. And one of the lines in it is, on myself revenge I'll proudly wreak, and make my form a patchwork of what's weak. And so to take revenge against God, he defiles the personal form, because man is made in the image of God. And then on the upside to that, flip side rather, you have Mikhail Bakunin, who was Marx's friend and then rival, and he lionized Satan as the first rebel and the great redeemer in a very disturbing way. He also invoked and inverted Voltaire in saying, if God did not exist, it would be necessary for us to abolish him. And we had to emulate the example of Satan to achieve the ultimate of human freedom. So it's interesting that all these things have coalesced in the augmentation and ultimately the total transcendence of the human body, and it's just led to utter unhappiness and misery. It's interesting those threads have crossed over there. Something interesting then, because I wanted to go on to your recapturing of the term feminism. And I asked Mary this, and I said, okay, if we've said, as we did earlier, that men are in a sort of meaning crisis where they can't really derive a sense of purpose and they can't actually service the women in their lives, and women are called to be more like men by some of the second wave feminists, and so they're at odds with their biology, and therefore many women are self-reporting unhappiness, and it's no wonder that lots of young girls are mutilating themselves to look like men. You're trying to reclaim the word feminism with Catholic feminism. Mary has tried to do it with reactionary feminism. So is it because the term feminism has become culturally synonymous with being in favor of women's interests that you're trying to reuse it? And is more feminism the answer to the excesses of past feminism?
I think that's a great question. This is something I've wrestled with for sure. I remember after I wrote my conversion memoir, I really was wrestling with whether to continue to embrace the label feminism. Because I obviously have a lot of critiques of feminism. And my process of conversion has involved a departure from kind of orthodox, so to speak, feminist views. And so when I do describe myself as a feminist, I describe myself as a feminist heretic. Whether it's helpful to maintain the term or not, I guess I'm a little bit more of just kind of a pragmatist on this. Like I'm not an ideologue. So I hold the term very loosely, right? But actually what I think inspired me to want to dust off my feminist bowling shoes, as it were, and kind of put those back on, was this sudden mainstreaming of the idea that that woman is just a category that you can identify into by fiat. And I thought, what is happening, right? So we're suddenly facing this unprecedented and very explicit erasure of woman, right? And so the wanting to say, like, no, we need to push against that. I would say there needs to be a movement that pushes against that, right? Whether or not it has the word feminism in it. Another motivation for me was the fact that in my own story, and also just seeing, like, teaching students for so many years, it's very common that women will come to college, they'll encounter feminism, and they'll just be like, this is awesome, and kind of embrace it, right? That it's just in the water, as it were. And I would often see in teaching in a Christian context that they would embrace Christian feminism, but there wasn't any real Christian content to it, right? And so I began to think about, like, okay, one, is a Christian feminism even possible? And two, well, if so, what would it look like, right? And the conclusion I've come to basically is that feminism tends to be more, what's the word? It's not a parasite, but like it's like grafted onto other philosophical systems, right? It doesn't have its own robust philosophical content to it. It actually has a very weak philosophical content. It borrows that from elsewhere. That's why you have Marxist feminism, or you have post-structuralist feminism, or so there isn't a lot of there, right? What it is, what kind of unites it, I would say, are kind of two fundamental beliefs. One, that there is this shared equality or dignity, equal dignity between the sexes, that is an ideal. And two, that there are forces in society that undermine that shared dignity. So yes, I do think those are both Christian beliefs, right? But if we're going to be talking about Christian feminism or Catholic feminism, then the philosophical content has to be Christian. Like, that has to be the ground and the roots of it. So I would say in a Christian understanding, you know, going back to Genesis, when you see the corruption of the relationship between man and woman, which happens through sin, which I think sin is this desire to be like God. It's basically what it is. It's this corruption of our nature, not a fulfillment of our nature, actually. So this corruption happens, and that's when we see a corrupt dynamic of domination, which historically has often been men over women, but I think can also be women over men, right? But it becomes this dynamic of conflict, resentment, control, power, right? So I do think there needs to be within the Christian world some, you know, I don't know if you want to call it a movement or whatever, but there needs to be some group that's being particularly attentive to the ways in which cultural forces play into that corruption, or whether they're trying to correct them, right? And so when I talk about Catholic feminism, that's what I mean.
Am I right in thinking that there's an actual structured Cultivating Catholic Feminism course out there?
Yes.
What does that entail?
Right. So it's a totally free course. It's called Cultivating Catholic Feminism. It was produced by this nonprofit called The Catholic Woman, and I wrote most of the scripts for it. And then, yeah, it's like the production quality is very great. I cannot be credited for that because I did not produce it. So the people behind it are amazingly creative. And yeah, so it's an attempt at formation, I think. So it's aimed especially at young women, college age women, women who are perhaps either already Christian and interested in feminism, but not sure how those things could relate, or perhaps a feminist who is vaguely interested in Christianity, but thinks, how would that work? So the videos are they're very short, and there's, so you can kind of go along at your own pace. But at first it sets up a framework for what Catholic feminism would look like, which would develop some of the ideas I've been talking about, right? So what would feminism look like if it were genuinely grafted onto a Christian worldview, right? So going through, the kind of anthropological claims about what a human being is, the kind of creation, redemption, fall. And then also there's a bunch of thematic videos, like what about abortion, contraception, gender, complementarity, the male priesthood, God as father, right? So all of these things, kind of frequently asked objections, you might say. So I want there to be a resource that shows how, like, what feminism would look like if it were truly authentically Catholic, right? Like, I want that to be articulated, because otherwise I think what could happen, and this is what happened to me, is that people will kind of go into secular feminism and then have this almost worldview change by osmosis without ever necessarily realizing that they've departed a Christian worldview along the way.
Yeah, from your dichotomy there, and something that I got from reading your first chapter, was that feminism, as you defined it, is a kind of heuristic for looking at the world as it currently is and saying, how do we extrapolate from those principles what to do in women's interests? And it has been contorted from as far back as the first wave was Mary Wollstonecraft and the more terrorist elements of the suffragettes to say, okay, rather than saying what the world is and how we should act, it's what we want the world to be and how to compel that to be the case. It's invoking that you shall be as God's idea. And instead, something like Catholic feminism would be to look at the world as biological reality, as our embodiment, and looking at the tenets of the metaphysics of the Bible, specifically the message of the Gospels as well, and saying, okay, we can all have this as a shared cultural framework, even for the secular members of our audience, because in all times and all places that this ethic has been practiced, it's been the most conducive to peace, prosperity, and intrasexual solidarity and complementarianism. And so even if you aren't fully bought into the metaphysics of heaven, hell, death, and the resurrection, this will be very good for both men and women. And so I wanted to pick up on that and say, how does this practically play out? Because we've already teased out the fact that there are two avenues to lean into our complementary virtues. There are relationships, and there's also a kind of cultural motherhood and fatherhood. I wondered if we could talk about the relationships aspect a little bit, because I read an article that was a critique of your conception of Catholic feminism. And it said, the problem is patriarchy is part of the divine plan and absolute equality is not. And that's why there is no Christian feminism. Let the modern egalitarian take heed of Pope Pius X's exhortation that women in war or parliament are outside their proper sphere, and their position there would be the desperation and ruin of society. Woman created as man's companion must so remain under the power of love and affection, but is always his power. Let him be mindful of Pope Pius XI's admonition in Divini Redemptoris that it is not true that all have equal rights in civil society. It is not true that there exists no lawful social hierarchy. Now, when you talked about the dynamic of the fall, with dominion not being man's entitlement to rule over woman, but rather that being his capacity for sin to dominate her, do you see that as a contradiction to the idea that we can have some? I'm trying to tease this out here. Do you see that as an impediment for us to have that kind of complementarian piece? And do you take any recognition from the person who wrote that critique?
Well, I think from just what you read, I guess, I mean, the devil's in the details, right? So what do you mean by equality? I think a big problem has been, in some ways, the problem is the anthropology of liberalism, which is very much about the human person as this atomic individual with these individual rights, right? And so then equality is often expressed or implicitly understood as sameness. And so when we talk about equality, I mean, I don't know. So this critique seems to be very preoccupied with power. And it almost seems like, and I again, I'm just speaking from what you just read, so this might not be what he's saying. But I guess the questions I would ask would be, what do you mean by equality? Is he denying that there's equal dignity? Because if he is, then I think that is pretty hard to square with Christian tradition and scripture. But if he's talking about equality in this kind of liberal equal rights sense, then I think that's a different sort of question, because I don't think that men and women should be equal in the sense of being totally interchangeable in society. Rather, I think there might even be cases where certain legal rights and protections might be sex specific, right? I think part of the problem has been interpreting equality as women adapting themselves to a kind of default male mode, right? So I don't know if he's really, I don't know that I'm an egalitarian in the sense that he's talking about. And then when it comes, I do read The Fall. It seems pretty clear to me, and it's not just me that's talking, like this is John Paul II. This is pretty much, so this is not just me going rogue here. But there's very much this sense of reciprocity. There is not a clear hierarchy between man and woman evident before the fall in scripture. But after the fall, that is one of the corruptions that happens, right? Is this desire for domination. So your desire will be for your husband, he will rule over you, right? So he will rule over you. To me, that seems very clearly to be a consequence of the fall. And the original order has a dynamic of harmony and reciprocity and communion. Notice I don't say equality, right? Because I just think that is a fraught word. But I think communion and reciprocity, mutuality is better. I also don't think that power per se is bad. You know, I would have a similar critique to the prominent kind of cultural idea that power is almost by its nature oppressive, right? I do think there are some natural hierarchies, and that those aren't necessarily bad or oppressive. For example, parent and child, right? In fact, I think I would be failing as a parent if I did not act as an authority figure over my child. But I do think that there's, I don't know. I'm kind of like, those are just some responses I had to what he said. But I don't know his critique in an in-depth way enough to be able to respond to it.
See, so from pulling out the idea of complementarianism, and if we can try and ground this practically in the relationship versus wedded to the world dichotomy we've got going here, the complementarian perspective, specifically in marriage, is very much put forward by St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 7. And I read that passage, revisited it about a week or so ago now, just in flicking through some potential content for Easter time, and frankly, that felt very much like, okay, here's exactly why there is a moral calling, as you said before, to become a husband and a father from the male perspective. And that is very much articulated by St. Paul in that passage for the same for women. You know, find each other so that you do not fall prey to sin with the abundance of options of prospective partners. And then eventually you end up alone and not being able to fulfill and emulate the love that God emanates, as an example. But there was a verse from Ephesians 5, which might lean on the idea of a hierarchy within that relationship, and how natural that is up for debate. But it was, be subject to one another, but out of reverence for Christ. Wives, be subject to your husbands as you are to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church, the body of which he is a savior. Just as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives must be subject to their husbands in everything. Now, does that make a virtue of that disequilibrated dynamic? Or how would the conception of complementary Catholic feminism play out in the practicals of a relationship?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a lot to get into in Ephesians 5. I'm glad you read verse 21. Sometimes people don't start with that prelude of mutual submission, right? Which I think is very important. Because anytime we're talking about relationships in a Christian or Catholic context, we're talking about mutual self-gift. Like, that's the Christian call, right? And so how that looks in different practical circumstances might vary. But so there's submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So there's this mutual submission, this kind of mutual reverence as well. And then we get this extended metaphor, this extended analogy between marriage and Christ and the church, right? So I think it's important, anytime we're talking about analogies, anytime we're talking about metaphors, there are always limits to that analogy and limits to that metaphor. So, for example, just to explain simply what I mean, when I say, like, Jesus is like a lamb, like, there's a very specific way in which Jesus is like a lamb that has to do with sacrifice and sacrificial economy. But there are all kinds of ways in which Jesus isn't like a lamb, right? So you can't kind of push something into equivalence when we're making a comparison to draw out certain meanings. So what is the meaning that's being drawn out in this extended metaphor? Well, two things are being illuminated here. One, the role of Christ in relation to the church is being illuminated. And arguably, the passage is more about that than it is about marriage, even though marriage in some ways is supposed to mirror that. So when we have language about the husband, like, purifying the wife, like, that's talking about Christ purifying the church, right? Because this passage isn't making a complete equivalence between a husband and Christ, because a husband doesn't have the power to purify. The husband actually is in need himself of purification. So we have to also remember that in relation to Christ, the human husband here is also a bride. Okay, so it's a complicated thing, and so I think if we have to make sure we're not just pushing the metaphor beyond its limits. But one thing I will point out too is that while people kind of sometimes, clutch their pearls over the verse that women should submit to their husbands, there's so much more detail here about how the husband should give himself up for the wife. If anything, it almost seems like what is being asked of a husband here is self-sacrifice. Like, that is what is being asked of him. That is the way in which he should emulate the church or Christ in relation to the church. And also by the sense of, like, nourishing and fulfillment, like what Christ makes, brings out the best in the church in, like, a literal way, right? By sanctifying us through the sacraments and freeing us from sin. So what does it look like to lovingly make oneself an offering on behalf of one's wife and work to bring out the best in her so that she flourishes in her full capacity as a human being and as a woman, right? Like, that's the question to be having. Like, my frustration about the feminist side and then the anti-feminist side is that everyone's just concerned with, like, who's wearing the pants, who's wearing the pants, who has the power, who's in charge, and I feel like that is not the Christian concern. The Christian concern should be, like, how am I outdoing the other person in love, right? So I don't see this relationship of characterized by power described here. I see a relationship characterized by love and mutuality. That's what I see there. And part of love is to submit oneself, right? Like, it annoys me actually in the mass readings when sometimes people don't read the women submit to your husbands piece. I'm like, no, that's part of it. Like, you got to read the whole thing. You have to get that whole picture of like mutuality between everyone in the body of Christ. And then also this submission in marriage where you have like the wife submitting and then the husband giving himself up for her. That's what the text says, giving oneself up for. So again, there's mutuality. I'll also just add as an aside, without going into too much detail, that the word head here, I think sometimes is misinterpreted as being like a boss. When headship in a biblical sense is better understood in terms of source, and it's much more of a generative term. So it's about, in a sense, being this like font of generosity. Like that's what the husband should be in the family. You know, he should be this generative font of love, that source of the family. So that's kind of how I would interpret that.
Yeah, you've brought two really great things to mind there. Again, it's nice to know that our thinking is joined up in isolation. One of the things that I discussed with my colleague Stelios when we were trying to define love, or I'd read C.S. Lewis's Four Loves, and one of the great lines he has in there is that the love between a man and a woman, a loving couple, can never be too much if your loves are always conceptualized as being in proximity to the highest love, which is God. So if you're emulating the example he emanates, then that mutual devotion to each other is always proportionate to the highest ideal, and that's a good thing for the both of you. And then something going back to what we talked about earlier in terms of the shared human nature, but the disparate manifestations of virtue in our embodiment between men and women. The example, the metaphor used in Ephesians with man being self-sacrificial and those sacrifices renewing that which is fallen, much like the death, resurrection, and rebirth of Christ, and the woman acting as the church in marriage to him, reminds me of how we conceptualized earlier the man going out and making sacrifices to settle the terrain, and then women being entrusted with the covenant of preserving and perpetuating cultural continuity along the family line. So you literally have the church spreading his word as a woman does the culture, as after the man in Christ's example has made the sacrifices to make it habitable for her. And I really like that dynamic and that reading of Ephesians. So that's brilliant. I wanted to finish then, obviously, if there's anything else you wanted to specifically talk about, please shoot, but finish with the succinct passage, which I think perfectly summarizes from you how we should view sexual difference and embrace it and live our lives in peace. Human beings, male and female, are endowed with a unique dignity marked by the image of their creator and entrusted with the sacred work of cultivating life. Sexual difference is not an extraneous or faulty feature of the cosmos, but an essential part of its goodness. And I think that's a really moralizing, metaphysically rich message for us to take forward. Is there anything you wanted to add, and where can people find you?
Yeah, I don't know that I would want to add anything except that, I think that is a good place to land, right? Like I think the question we should be asking and meditating on is, how do we steward our nature well, rather than how do we try to erase it or manipulate it or bring it under our control? And that our nature, I think, calls us to something. Like, because I am a woman, I am called to something, right? Because you are a man, you are called to something. Why, what are we called toward? That to me, I think, is the more interesting question, the more important question. Where can people find me? I don't really want to be found. Oh, I'm just kidding. Half kidding. I have one little pinky toe on social media. So I am on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter. I've been off for Lent. I kind of dip in and out of Twitter. I do like a feast and famine kind of thing. I have the Genesis of Gender book. I have a conversion memoir as well called Into the Deep, an Unlikely Catholic Conversion. I have lots of essays online you can find by Googling. So I want people to find my writings. Yeah. I don't necessarily want them to find me.
Yeah. And I do encourage everyone to go out and buy the book, because it is really enriching for both the mind and the soul. And we over at Logocentrism spend a lot of time reading horrible news stories, particularly on the trans issue, particularly what's happening to plenty of children. But to have something fulfilling and a positive vision to move forward with is really important. So thank you very much for writing it. I look forward to reading your future books, and I appreciate talking with you this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you. This was a great conversation.
All right. Bye all.